All right, let's get started. I'm excited to welcome everyone to this webinar. This session is being recorded today and will be posted on EduLinks and shared on USAID's Center for Education social media handles. My name is Andrew Moe, and I'm a System Strengthening Governance and Localization Specialist with USAID's Center for Education. Today, we will be discussing how public-private partnerships can improve basic education services. We know that PPPs are a key way that USAID's Center for Education is advancing the agency's strategy on private sector engagement and a core approach in our education finance toolbox. We're joined today by Suzanne Lee, Senior Education Finance Specialist in USAID's Center for Education, to provide opening remarks, along with a distinguished panel, including Gustavo Arcia, Senior Economist Consultant with Data and Evidence for Education Program, Harry Petrinos, Advisor, Office of the Chief Economist for Europe and Central Asia at the World Bank, as well as Paul Nabila Napari, Project Management Specialist from USAID Ghana Mission. Thank you so much for Data and Evidence for Education Program for hosting today's webinar. And to get us started for the agenda today, we will begin with opening remarks from Suzanne Lee, and then shift to the PPP evidence review led by Gustavo Arcia. Following this, we'll engage in a panel discussion with Harry Petrinos, along with Paul from USAID Mission, before concluding with questions and answers. Throughout the session, please put any questions you have into the chat box, and we'll consolidate for the end for questions and answers. Now, let me first introduce Suzanne Lee and Gustavo Arcia. Suzanne Lee has worked on education finance and policy issues in developing countries for the past 19 plus years at USAID. She's currently the Senior Education Finance Specialist within the Center for Education. And in this role, she leads our work around education finance, specifically regarding public-private partnerships, public financial management, and innovative financing mechanisms to improve learning outcomes. Gustavo Arcia is a senior economist with experience in public and private education finance, school-based management, school autonomy and accountability, and education policy reform, doing consulting, working for the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, UNICEF, USAID, the Brookings Institute, and the UNESCO Institute for Statistics in more than 25 countries in Latin America, East and Central Asia, West Africa, and the Middle East. He co-authored the World Bank's book, Assessing Sector Performance and Inequality in Education, the World Bank's SABRE benchmark report on school autonomy, and numerous reports on education finance and education policy reform. I'll now invite Suzanne to share some opening remarks.
All right, thanks, Andrew. I'm excited to welcome everyone to this webinar. As you all know, learning poverty was high before the pandemic hit. Since then, COVID-19 and related disruptions to education exacerbated the learning crisis, worsening learning inequality among children, with the most marginalized hit the hardest. Recovering from setbacks and achieving sustainable improvements in learning outcomes and sustainability is a long-term endeavor that will require all of us to leverage all the tools, resources, and education partners to address it, including private sector resources. A core part of our challenge is recognizing the global financing shortfalls while still making a progress in a sector that's perpetually under-resourced. Governments and donors play a critical role in filling the financing gap, but cannot currently meet the full demand alone to provide quality education to all children, particularly in low-income countries. Private sources now represent nearly 90% of financial flows to developing countries. To leverage this capital for development gains, USAID's private sector engagement policy illustrates how we at USAID consistently and comprehensively integrate private sector engagement into the agency's operating model and programming across sectors. Public-private partnerships in basic education have gradually grown in importance as a policy tools over the past 2 decades. Whether it is utilized to supplement government funds for education, increase access and choice for students and parents, or deliver specialized services such as technology integration, PPPs offer an opportunity to improve the functioning of education systems and ultimately hope to achieve better learning outcomes. The private sector typically faces fewer bureaucratic, institutional, and financial constraints. As a result, a PPP may be more efficient and/or more effective in carrying out the responsibilities of government. PPPs in basic education are a key way the Center for Education is advancing the agency's strategy on private sector engagement and is one approach in our education finance toolbox. USAID, in partnership with Data and Evidence for Education Program, DEEP, reviewed evidence on what works in public-private partnerships in basic education, which includes pre-primary through technical and vocational education and training. A PPP guide was developed based on this evidence review. The PPP guide explains in what context does a PPP make sense, what considerations should be taken into account, and what pitfalls should be avoided. We hope this guide and this session will help you to know when and how to better integrate PPPs in your education activities. I'll turn it over to Gustavo, who will share with us the key findings from this public-private partnership education guide. Over to you, Gustavo.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you very much. Welcome all. I would like to set a tone like a conversation because this is a new field relatively, and we are still learning. The evidence is being generated around the world. And what we are doing here is kind of having a reflection about what's going on and trying to classify the different situations in which public-private partnerships are occurring and trying to gather evidence as we go along. Before we go into what are public-private partnerships, I would like to ask, why do we get involved with the private sector in the provision and the financing of a public good like education? There are, excuse me, there are a couple of several reasons. One is that government funding for education sometimes is insufficient to fulfill the educational mandates, either because it's a growing faster than expected enrollment, because tax revenues are lower than expected, or because of inefficiencies in the use of funds. So governments look at ways in which they can co-finance education. There are other cases in which there may be difficulty accessing different languages, marginal areas, and so on, and private concerns can be quicker in implementing education in those areas. There is another aspect too, in which often the public schools tend to be of lower performance than the private schools, and parents are the ones wanting more choice, and therefore they would like to have their children to access private schools in the hopes of getting a better education. And finally, we have technology is advancing quicker than everybody expects. And sometimes government do not have the means or the staff to bring schools into the new technological realms. And therefore, private sector is uniquely positioned to help out in these things. So before we go on, we would like to say, what is a public-private partnership? We hear the term around all over the place, but in reality, when we are going to be very strict about it, is the contract between the government and the private entity. And in that contract, we share the risks of the product, the costs, and the resources. Unless those three terms are present, it's difficult to call it a partnership. It's very similar to a partnership in any business. The partners share the benefits and the risks and the costs. Now, in the public-private partnership, the payment to the private partner is linked to the compliance with the contract. In that case, what we are looking for is ways to make the partnership accountable. So in essence, it's a contract in which we share the risks, the costs, and the benefits. Next. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Why? What's so special about the private sector? What do they bring? Well, as Susan mentioned earlier, they can be very efficient in delivery. We all know about public bureaucracies. Purchasing can take a long time, as a deployment of teachers can take a long time. Private people can be quicker. They can deliver education in a better, more efficient manner in many cases. In some cases, for example, in the new technologies, the specialized skills are found in the private sector. The private institutions can be nimbler. They have smaller bureaucracies. They have managers that are dedicated for implementation. They can be more responsive to the signals of the labor market. So they, in the case, for example, of Tibet, they can already have better instruments, better approaches, better topics than the public sector. They can be more flexible in adopting innovations because private sector incentives usually imply that if you are not at the edge of the market will leave you. They have to be very quick and flexible in adopting any innovations, and therefore that can be brought to the public sector. Then finally, they can allow for greater transparency and accountability because of the contract. If you have a contract to deliver certain products at a certain time with a certain level of quality, that allows for education to have a little bit more transparency and accountability. Next. Now, why would the private sector be interested in mixing with government? No, there is always the folklore that government can be very complicated, very bureaucratic, they don't pay well, things like that. But then why would I go into a contact with government? First, there is a direct return on financial investment. There is a business proposition in there, and there is a benefit that can be taken. Also, in the case of innovations, government sometimes is the perfect platform to co-develop new technological innovations that can also expand the private market. And therefore, this partnership can be very productive for them to go into the type B innovations or different aspects of public sector interaction that they are trying to develop, and then they can share the costs and the risk with the government. There is another aspect, is that being in a public-private partnership gives many companies this better reputation of contributing to society, improving the public realm, and increase the size of the pie. They help increase economic and social growth, and therefore eventually they will benefit from it. And there is also a little bit of a selfish approach in which, by contributing in a partnership to the improvement of schools and learning, they get in return more skilled workers, a better educated labor force, and therefore they can become more productive and more competitive over time. So that's a benefit for them. And also the public recognition for their contributions to society. So those are a few of the cases in which, for the private companies, it can be good to be in a partnership with government. Next. Now, we have to forget that PPP is an instrument that we can use in search of a problem. No, we are trying to figure out, first of all, that they are just the means to educational goals. We want to improve the performance of schools. We want for parents to have a better school choice. In terms of the coverage, sometimes we need to expand coverage very quickly and also to improve school quality. Sometimes teacher performance and learning outcomes can be improved with better training provided by the private sector. And in the case of Tibet, we can get very direct access of our students into new technology and new companies, or companies that are well established but have a need for skilled labor, and there are opportunities for collaboration there that are very important for government and for the private sector. And also finally, to improve infrastructure quality and coverage, and we will go over that later, because sometimes infrastructure is not enough, and there is a unique position for the private sector to contribute in that area. Next. Here we have this slide is interesting for us because it shows that in the case of the public-private, the concept of partnership implies that there is a demand and a supply side. And we are trying to get this market in education to work better. And briefly, what are the education sector demands? We want to improve learning. We want to improve school and teacher performance. We want to increase school choice. We want to expand coverage, quality, teacher performance, improve TVET, and infrastructure. That's what we want on the side of the demand. And on the supply side, there are different types of arrangements, which we will discuss in some of them in some detail, that can help us meet those demands. So the idea here is that we are trying to improve education, and in this market we have some demands, and on the private side there are some parts that can be supplied, and therefore we are trying to figure out how to get this partnership going to meet supply and demand. Next. The most typical case in low and middle income countries is the need to expand access. And as I mentioned earlier, sometimes government get caught by surprise because they don't have enough money, or because there was a problem with the refugees, or because the coverage in some areas is expanding rapidly, and so on. So we need to expand school coverage. And what do? We have public finance and private provision. Is a very key aspect that determines the partnership. And there are several types of partnerships that are used to expand school coverage. The first one is vouchers, is very common, and school-based management, subsidies, low-cost private schools, and scholarships. I would like to discuss not all of them, the ones that we are going to see later on, but there are some that are almost part of the folklore, and it is nice to get an idea about what really means. Let's start with vouchers. A voucher is a coupon that allows students to shop around for a private school. In essence, is the voucher holder can look around among different private schools that accept the voucher and get into one that fits their needs. Maybe it's closer to home, maybe it has some aspects of the curriculum that they find attractive, there is a reputation attached to it. Whatever reasons, it gives parents and the student the purchasing power to go into the private market and expand the choices of education for themselves. Now, the case of the vouchers is curious because, first of all, not all private schools may accept the voucher. It's a negotiation between the government and some private schools in which the value of the voucher is negotiated, typically close to what the school would charge a private student. And then there are issues also of once you get in there, over time, vouchers can have some unintended consequences. One is that people complain, especially in the public sector, that the vouchers allow their best students to take off and leave the bad students in the school, kind of exaggerating inequality and only leaving the underperforming students. There is a perverse incentive for private schools to start creeping up the value of the tuition so they can price gouge government. Those are the two main risks associated with vouchers. If properly managed and if properly understood by government, these risks can be minimized. But we have to figure out that vouchers is good, but there are some risks involved. There are some prominent cases around the world of the voucher system, and typically are found in middle income and high income countries. Chile is a case in point in which they started vouchers many years ago, and it has gone through some evolution of it. They were proved to be very popular and gave parents the issue of choice. Now, over time, there were some problems because of transparency. Every year they published the best performing schools, and that created tremendous instability in the system because people were shopping around every year for a better school because they had a voucher. Over time, they had to change the system and increase the value of the voucher, and also to improve equity, to avoid this problem of leaving the underperforming students in the public system. They gave a premium to those underperforming students so private school could have a financial incentive to accept them. And it's sort of working along fairly well along those lines in the case of Chile. It has been well studied, and there are references in the report where you can go into it and look in more detail about the issue of vouchers. Another important part of the expanding access is in the school-based management. There are two types of public-private partnerships that are very interesting. One is the concession school, and the other one is a contract school. Next. In the case of the concessions and contract school, charter schools, there is a combination. You are not only expanding coverage, but you're also trying to improve learning. And in this case, you are using school-based management means to get better teachers, better managed teachers, better personnel, more efficient operations of schools that in the end contribute to learning. It is not only about having a good teacher, but also the way that the school works. It assigns resources and manages students in a way that students feel motivated. In the case of concession schools, we have a concession school works more like a McDonald's. The government has a curriculum, the attendance standards, the acceptance standards, the teacher standards. Teachers remain as employees, but the concession school is a manager that is going to follow the public rules and is in charge of managing the school more efficiently. Now, the government provides the financing, and the private provider is the manager with a lot of autonomy. And now it's usually applied to low quality public schools, poor teacher performance, low student learning, and limited school choice. Concession schools are good for that. Now, the contract with the concession school, the government pays a per student amount, and the contract specifies all aspects of school operations. Okay, that is almost like, again, like a McDonald's. These are the rules. This is the uniform. This is the textbook. This is the curriculum, and you comply with that. You manage it more efficiently, and we should get a better school and a better student. The experience from Colombia in this case has proven to be very successful. For example, dropout rates have decreased, performance in learning have improved on par to the good public schools. And the concessionaires are responsible. If they do not meet the goals established in the contract, then they are out of the contract. So that's the part where accountability comes into place and improves education. Now, there is another case, for example, where charter schools is another case in which you have um, it's a government school but managed fairly independent. Again, it's a school-based management, and the idea is to improve learning. In the case of charter schools, it may have something special like a religious instruction or language instruction or some kind of a addition to the curriculum that parents like and they are willing to go into there. Next. Oh, I'm sorry, go back one. I wanted to say something about. In the case of improved learning, it's also typical to find subsidized schools. I work a lot in the case of places like Belize, a country where 75% of the students attend a private school with government funding. Government pays for the teachers and part of the school operations. The infrastructure and part of the school operations is paid by church-based schools. And it has been working very well for many, many years. And in this case, the issue of the contract is the curriculum has to comply with the national curriculum, and there are expectations about school performance. And that way, it works very well. It lowers the cost per student for the government, and it fulfills the mandate of the private school in terms of religious mission and so on. So here is another case where improving learning and expanding coverage works well in the case of a church-based school. Next. One area where things are growing well is in the strengthening teachers training. We all know that teacher training programs in ministries of education have a relatively bad reputation. And it's like a mini camp. You go to a hotel, you take some courses, you go back to the classroom, nobody's minding whether you apply it, what you learn in this teaching training, whether it works or not, and so on. With the private sector, you can co-finance teacher training in specific areas that the private sector excels. In particular, this is interesting in the case of ICT, where the government has no particular expertise because technology is changing all the time, and management training with NGOs and philanthropies, where NGOs and philanthropies have a very strong sense of mission, and they are willing to co-finance the program and teach and provide teacher training under contract more efficiently than is traditionally done. So strengthening teachers through teacher training in a public-private partnership has been proving increasingly better in the case of specifically of ICTs and NGOs. Next. Finally, we go to infrastructure. We always hear about public-private infrastructure issues, especially in mid-income to high-income countries, where the private sector can build a school and lease it back to the government. And the government doesn't have to start through a whole process of financing, finding the financing, supervising the school building, the construction of the school, and so on. The private sector does that, and there is a lease back arrangement with the government. There are other cases where the infrastructure is built and sold back to the government. In other cases in which the school is built by the private sector, is operated under a contract, and it leased back in after the contract is over. There are different cases of operations with private partnership combining finance, operations, management, and all kinds of arrangements. Here, we have to be very careful. It's very popular, but there are opportunities for corruption everywhere, even in the highest income countries. One is, for example, having the construction cost being a real estate game rather than just an education game. Leasing back the lease can be very tricky. It has to be well detailed in the contract. There are opportunities for selecting a construction company doing the financing and leasing, but there are opportunities for under the table payment and so on. It's very delicate, and in many countries it's approved very tricky, but it is also very interesting proposition. I know that in the United States, there are different arrangements that has been going on for 30 years, and they seem to work. Occasionally, you have some blips in there of corruption, but in general, it's a very good, interesting partnership that we should keep in mind when you need infrastructure quickly. So those are really the main areas where public-private partnerships are occurring. I want to emphasize that they are in response to a problem, not a solution in search of a problem. Next. Tibet is a very interesting approach. In medium to low income countries, vocational education is going to become a very important policy to pursue, because we are getting to the point in which you have a very quickly growing labor force of 14 to 16-year-olds leaving school with low skills, low fundamental skills. And Tibet is a great opportunity for them to have them enter the labor force with some skills that they can sell and that can become more productive. And productivity is the name of the game for the private sector. And there are internships co-financed with tech training and private facilities. The development of education software and platform for distance education is another two big cases where Tibet can be very, very good opportunity for developing partnership with private providers. And this is something that is still developing, especially after COVID. It has become kind of a hotbed of ideas that we should not be afraid of pursuing, as long as we are very careful about the contract language. Next. So there are different types: vouchers, concession schools, contract schools, internships, training opportunities for co-financing. But there are challenges. In the case of philanthropies, contributing to education and becoming a partner, sometimes countries do not have enough income for philanthropy. That's important to know. So that takes out many countries. There is also, and I have lived through it, insufficient strong private market. In many countries, I've seen them in Central Asia, I've seen them in some in small countries in South America. The strong provision of private services is not there. So we have to be very careful, because then it's like going to a mall and there are no stores. So here we have a case where we want to have a public-private partnership, but the private sector is not well developed in education. So we have to find other solutions. We have to be very careful about that. In other places, the private sector management systems may be not well developed, and we have to be very aware that if we are going to do concession schools or any school-based management, there should be a good supply of good managers, and sometimes they are not there. Or the market, the private school market is too small or not diverse. Those are really contextual challenges. For me, there are two important ones in this case. One is that the government may not have enough capacity to manage a PPP. This is very important. The moment you get into a contract, you should be able to monitor the contract performance, monitor the products, get the results, evaluate the results. And sometimes governments do not have enough capacity to do that efficiently. And therefore, you have a public-private partnership that may work very well or may not work at all. And the government is not sufficiently capable of monitoring the performance of this arrangement. The other one is that we know that monitoring and evaluation in government, in education in particular, can be very tricky. You need very specialized personnel that are sometimes overwhelmed, and therefore having a good monitoring and evaluation system is crucial to monitor the performance of PPP and make the arrangement profitable for both parties. So these contextual challenges is something that USAID project officers should always keep in mind about under what conditions this PPP should work, and do we have those conditions present to make it work. Next. Now, we can mitigate these contextual challenges. One is we need, and the document is a rich source of information. If you want to go in depth in that type, in every type of partnership, you need to understand clearly what you are getting into. In particular, the legal framework is so important because what is in the contract is what can be monitored and asked accounts for. There should be a good environment for the private sector partnership. There should be a good perception that the private sector, you are not privatizing education. That can be a very politically incendiary remark, but that there is a partnership in which both partners bring something to the table and to the benefit of the public and the students. You can establish robust monitoring and evaluation systems. And that's how do you mitigate a weakness that we talked about before. One aspect that I think is very, very important is to be aware of the cost per student, and under different circumstances. If you don't know the cost per student, it's going to be very hard to monitor performance in terms of cost efficiency. And then also you have to have a solid legal framework for addressing corruption. Some countries, for example, Peru, Panama, have already specifically started getting a legal framework in place to protect themselves, protect government from PPP corruption. So these are the mitigations that you can establish. Having said that, I think it's an exciting opportunity for looking at PPPs for improving education. Next. Well, I think we're at this point that we can talk about scenarios, but Suzanne, can you introduce the next step?
Sure. And Gustavo, thank you so much. This is Amy Mulcahy. Gustavo, thank you so much for your wonderful and very rich presentation and explanation of public-private partnerships. I particularly enjoyed hearing the specific examples. So we're going to move into a brief activity now, just to give you an opportunity to test out your knowledge about PPPs. You'll see here on the screen's scenario, and if you also look in the chat, you'll be able to see a link for the Menti. If you click on that link, you'll have an opportunity to both see the scenario and also respond to questions. So I'll give you a second. Let us know if you have any trouble with the Menti link. So is everybody in the Menti now? And Emma and Jack, would you be able to broadcast results once they become available? Great, thank you so much. We'll give people another minute to put in their answers. All right, I'll turn to you, Gustavo. Could you comment on
Yes,
the results?
this is very interesting. Um, the last one I would like to address: privately built schools leased back to the government. I told you it was sexy. This is really something that everybody is talking about in the United States, specifically about infrastructure. You don't have enough money. Let the private sector build the school, lease it back to you, and then you pay like you are buying an apartment or a house, like in the mortgage. You pay, you finance it. That's a very good suggestion, and I want to emphasize the trick is in the details. How much interest are you going to charge the government? How much do you inflate the cost? At the end of the leaseback period, can you resell the school at what profit? Those are very key issues that are going to be complicating this aspect. Concession schools, I see that very few people look at it. And increasing school access in rural areas, well, concession schools, you have to have the school in place. And therefore, it may not be as easily done if you want quick increasing school access in rural areas. Concession school may not be as good of a choice as the low-cost private school, for example. Low-cost private school can quickly go and at a cost that is convenient to the government and expand quickly the student access. I like that. School subsidies to church sponsored school, also a very nice suggestion. The other two are not wrong, but they have complications. So therefore, they will not be my preferred choice. But the low-cost private schools and school subsidies, they seem to do the trick for me. Maybe
Great.
people can comment on it if they want to discuss about what they saw.
I think we have, unfortunately, Gustavo, I think we have everybody else muted. So
Okay.
if you don't mind, we'll move to the next
Okay.
scenario.
Sure.
So everyone hears the scenario. You should be able to see your Menti moving to the next question. But if not, please click on the link again here. And again, give you a minute or two to look at the scenario and to put in your question. Then we'll go back to Gustavo for his reflections. Right, let's take a look at the results if we can. Great, thank you. We'll give folks another second to add in some answers.
I think this is nice. Okay, there are a couple of things in here. We all agree practically that the co-financing of a tech software and platform development with tech companies is a very good idea. And this is happening. In the paper, several examples are mentioned of what's going on. And there are other cases where we should start questioning whether it's a partnership or not. Let's take corporate discounts on laptops and software. Is that a partnership? No, it's simply a discount. It's a one-time deal. If you are a student, you buy this laptop, we'll give you a discount. There is no risk sharing and there is no partnership. The free internet with advertising, that's a very interesting proposal. That's an interesting thing that we'll have to think about, whether having a free internet completely solved the problem. It may not, because we still have some issues of getting the devices, the software, and the knowledge. So the co-financing with the EdTech software makes a better case for it. The philanthropic donation is not really a partnership. It's just a donation, one-time deal. I give you this and I leave. And therefore, we tend to confuse these issues. I don't blame you. It's a lot of language that people advertise in the newspapers. A public-private partnership with computer ABC is going to donate 10 computers to the school, and that's it. That's not a partnership, it's a donation. So the co-financing of EdTech software seems to think to me that is the right track. So to conclude, before I give back to Suzanne, is that we have to realize that properly designed in responding to clearly defined problems, the PPP can be a very good mechanism for expanding and improving education. But we have to be good consumers. Please read carefully the report. It has plenty of links for examples of vouchers, for examples of concession schools, for examples of Tibet arrangements, especially in Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. There are examples in there that are very interesting for developing new software, new platforms, and so on. There's the idea is that you become a very good consumer of information. So when you look at the potential for private-public partnership, you understand what are the benefits, the potential pitfalls, and therefore be better prepared for it. And with this, I give you my thanks, and let's go to the next speaker. I think it's Suzanne.
Yes, thanks, Gustavo. So what we're going to do now is turn to our panelist, and who has had actually deep experience in public-private partnerships, some real examples. So we have here Dr. Harry Petrinos, who's worked as an advisor at the Office of the Chief Economist for Europe and Central Asia at the World Bank. And he specializes in the educations of economics, and he's worked a lot on these PPP that we could speak to. And then we also have here in our panelist, Paul Napari, who is an experienced education specialist in the USAID Ghana satellite offices in Northern Ghana. He has been with USAID since 2014 and has successfully managed the missions flagship activity, USAID Partnership for Education Learning, that he'll speak more about, and his deep experience with PPP. What I'd like to do is I'd like to turn it to over to Harry first to give, because he has pretty a breadth of experience on public-private partnerships. And I know that in the chat box, I saw that one of a participant asked some examples in Asia, and I was thinking, well, Harry has tons of experience in Asia and can speak to that, having worked in that bureau. So maybe I turn it over to Harry to provide like a 10-minute kind of reflections and kind of maybe some examples of both the challenges and opportunities, and in what context these PPPs really make sense in the education, especially for USAID in low income context. Over to you, Harry.
Thanks a lot, Suzanne, and thank you to USAID for commissioning this work. Thanks to Gustavo and Amy for writing the report. I enjoyed the presentation. I enjoyed the questions in the chat. I wanted to make a few comments, and happy to offer a few words of examples. Give some examples. So first, I think the definition of public-private partnerships is quite appropriate and useful for thinking about this as one tool that we have in designing and supporting government programs to improve learning outcomes, which is the goal after all. I think the idea of having a contract that specifies the the roles, shares risks as described by Gustavo in the report is useful, and also understanding who's paying for what and what we're trying to achieve. The benefits of in theory are many, and they've been well described in the report. I think I would emphasize that we focus on outcomes, and in the case of education, basic education, low-income countries, as Suzanne said, the focus should be on improving learning outcomes for the poorest segments. There are some benefits. There are actually means towards that end. So, for example, partnerships that improve teacher performance. It's great to have better teachers, but the goal is so they're better teachers, so the learning process improved, and therefore the outcome of learning is improved. So no disagreement with the report, but I would emphasize the benefits, the outcomes, more than the means. I think in education, we all know that we have these dual goals, access and coverage on the one hand and quality on the other. If you think about it, there aren't that many sectors or industries where you've got these competing goals that sometimes put us at odds, right? So you could have expansion of coverage, but it's poor quality. So are you really achieving much in the end? I think where the contract concept and the partnership idea gives us a lot of benefit is that we can actually specify increase access with quality and make that part of the contract. I don't think it would be useful to have expansion of low quality education or no quality education, as the case may be, but rather let's specify the quality of education. And if, what I want to also mention later is the capacity concern. I think that's one of the areas that I would emphasize. It is mentioned as a concern in the report. I think the capacity to negotiate contracts shouldn't be underestimated. And I think this is where a better PPP is designed. It's not so much what it's trying to do, but how it's specified. I think with the emphasis on learning, it brings us a step closer to what we actually want to achieve. We want to see countries growing sustainably, achieving their own goals, improving equity, and ultimately we want to see the labor market outcomes of these programs. I know our programs and projects don't allow us in many cases to see labor market outcomes, except in TVET. So there, I think we can specify labor market outcomes, whereas in primary education, it would be difficult to see that, except over many years. And then ultimately the social benefits that come from a more educated population. It's not only that the individual getting the education will do better in school and earn more, but also the society benefits from having more educated people. I take a little bit of difference on the infrastructure PPPs. I think infrastructure PPPs on their own do not necessarily improve education outcomes. I would much prefer to see PPPs and infrastructure that include both the building and running of the school, either building by the private sector, then run with a contract with the private sector, or built with the private sector and handed over to the public sector, or even better, the evidence suggests public school buildings built for purpose and then run by the private sector and contract, the concession schools that Gustavo mentioned. And I would put a lot of emphasis on looking at the concession school models, especially in countries where you have a vibrant private sector that's probably educating relatively wealthier children, bringing them into the space where they can educate lower income children and improve learning outcomes. I I think the challenges that are described in the report are done very well. I would add to the challenges accountability. If we lack accountability in an education system, it's difficult to have a good contract, difficult to have a good education system, as well as limits on what the contracts can do. So accountability, holding providers accountable, having exit clauses for the public sector when these aren't working, having measurement of the goals of the contract. So if we're improving learning outcomes, let's measure learning outcomes. Let's have a target. And I don't think it's enough that we simply ask for improvements over what the poor performing schools are doing, but rather we want to achieve goals like reading for meaning by grade 4, or being able to read and understand a simple passage by age 10, something that demonstrates mastery. I don't think it's a lot to ask that we get foundational learning for all children at the early grades. So I would push for that kind of accountability. The other challenge, I think, is the inefficiency of public funds. Gustavo alluded to charter schools. The effective charter schools, I think, without exception, are getting a per student funding that's equal to what the public school students receive. So without equal funding, it's hard to expect equal outcomes. And in many low-income countries, we see programs that give the private sector less than what the government spends on public schools. Hard to expect the same results. So public funds need to be there. And then the final challenge I would add to Gustavo's list is artificial caps on partnerships. If the model works, why not expand it? I don't think it's someone in the, or was it Gustavo mentioned, one of the criticisms is that having PPPs takes students out of the public system. I think we're talking about public schools. Charter schools, concession schools are public schools. There's no increase in private education in these cases. In fact, if you do these models that incorporate private schools into the system, you're actually increasing the level of public control over the education system. So it's the opposite of the criticism. So bringing evidence to bear and cost-effective solutions, why not increase the numbers? In order to be effective, PPPs, I would add here to some of the things that Gustavo mentioned. I think they need to be innovative in the sense that they're identifying and trying to solve a problem. So we think that there isn't enough coverage in rural areas, for example. Is PPPs a viable option? That's an empirical statement. Design an experiment, see if it works. So you're finding an innovation to solve a problem. Second condition for effectiveness, I would say accountability. I already mentioned this. Third, I would say empowering parents and students. We would want to see a PPP that actually increases the choices to parents who are from limited budgets, so that they can also have some of the options that richer families do. So PPP should expand their choices and give them a greater say in how resources are used in their country. And the final effectiveness condition, I would say, is promoting diversity of supply. Gustavo already mentioned this. Without any supply, it's hard to do contracting. Who would be the provider? So finding ways to create more opportunities and increase the supply. I think the main condition for success in this sphere is the design issues. It matters a lot. We can call it implementation in our projects. And when won't PPPs work? When information is lacking. Hard to see improvements if we don't know what we're trying to improve. So measurement, when accountability is not enforced, again, why would you expect results if you're not measuring and holding providers accountable? Capacity constraints, both on the supply side, but also on the government capacity to negotiate and design good PPPs. I think this is something that we could help with and support the public sector. And then when information is not disseminated, the public doesn't know what you're trying to do with these models, then somebody else fills in the narrative. So it's important to understand and to disseminate this information to the public. And consistent, I think, with what the USAID is doing overall in its programs is testing and evaluating what works. I think we should base any program on what's worked elsewhere, what the literature says, but adapt it to local conditions and use the project to test whether it works, under what conditions, and do rigorous impact evaluation. Use this evidence to decide what to scale up, what to scale down, what to tweak, what to change. And I think where this report adds a lot of value is that it gives you the background to be able to ask the right questions as you design programs, as you think about implementation of programs, as you think about the contracts, and have a lot of questions about the capacity, the design of the program. And I would say, whatever we do, let's measure, let's evaluate rigorously, and use those results to improve the programs. And evaluation shouldn't be this versus nothing, but rather variations of programs designed to address the same problem, and compare those programs and choose those that are more cost effective. After all, we want to get more children into good schools, so cost effectiveness is very important. I think for examples, my suggestion is to study the concession model in Bogota. I think this is applicable for many countries that have a vibrant non-state sector that's usually educating wealthier children, and these can be brought in to support public goals. The other excellent example comes from Pakistan in the Punjab, where the emergence of low-cost private schools led to concerns by government. What they decided to do was to evaluate whether it works and to fund those that are working well, meaning that they're serving low-income populations and improving the quality of education. So a lot of the models that Gustavo mentioned, they're probably being implemented somewhere in the Punjab and Sindh and in Pakistan, and there have been very rigorous evaluations of those programs, and they seem to be working quite well. It's a evolving issue, but I think the literature is quite strong from Pakistan and Colombia as well. I would also end by saying I think the idea of thinking about the contract and thinking of the right questions to ask as you design programs are probably the biggest takeaways from this workshop. And while it's right to look at examples, your own country will be different, and you have to adjust these programs for local context and the conditions that are present. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry, for those comments. What I'd like to do now is turn it over to Paul. And so Paul could share an actual example that he had worked on and managed over public-private partnership. And he will share out how that was put together and what the challenges and opportunities were with that activity. So Paul, I turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Susan. So it looks like my bandwidth is not very strong, so I'm going to turn off my video. Is that okay with everyone? I want to turn off my video and then can just speak.
That's okay, Paul.
Okay, great.
At least we have your lovely voice, Paul.
Sure. Well, so I just have 7 minutes. I also have 7 minutes to respond to a couple of questions. And so mine will be very specific. And I think the first question that I remember was asked was, what need did we have? Or why was a PPP identified as a solution? And so when I listened to Gustav, so we have our approach to PPP was a hybrid of most of the things that he talked about. For example, we had the need of, number one, ownership and sustainability. These were the key things: ownership and sustainability of the intervention that we brought in. This was, a PPP to ensure learning outcomes in education and primary education, right? And so we are looking at, you see, in Ghana, the situation is like that. Is the government who does everything in public schools. Government build the schools, government train the teachers, government pays the teachers, and government does everything. That's what happens in public schools here in Ghana. And so because of that, I've heard Harry and Gustav talk about the inability to meet the cost of education because there's not enough money to do that. In across developing countries and middle income countries, you'll see this very prominent. And so the issue was to be able to make sure that as the communities, and we work to the structure in Ghana, that the local government system is like that. We have the national, we have the subnational, and we have the district levels and the communities. So what we're trying to do is to empower the communities and to empower the districts so that they can raise this, they can approach the PPP, the private setups to be able to mobilize enough resources to do these things. So that's what I said. It's interesting scenario, is a hybrid sort of thing where we did a lot of training, for the communities themselves, for the district themselves, to be able to identify private, institutions, private companies, and mobilize the funds. But in many other cases, the IP also approached the private institutions directly to mobilize these resources. So basically, the need was to ensure ownership. And once you ensure ownership, then the project is sustained. People know what they go through to raise money to be able to do, and they're able to handle the projects very well and don't allow them. Usually in developing countries, when government provides these facilities, when government provides these interventions, most of the times, people don't take very good care of it. But when they get out themselves and see the difficulty in mobilizing these resources, they are very careful and they handle these projects and they become more sustainable. So basically, that's what I would say in response to the first question. The second question is, what types of PPP did you apply? And when we're doing this, we're not looking at types of PPP, but I haven't listened to Gustav and heard Harry talk about it. I think, like I said already, that we had a hybrid. Number one, I think that we had a school-based management, right? School-based management approach. We had a co-finance teacher training where we use school facilities, the local district school facilities, government facilities to conduct training. So you see, in trying to improve learning outcomes, there are varied activities that are involved in. Number one, we had to procure teaching and learning materials. we had to train teachers how to use these materials, and you had to supervise, you had to monitor the use of these materials to make sure that they are using the right methodology in teaching and delivery. And so in all of these things, we had varied, we made different or, hybrid attempts to be able to do that. And we also had private design, build, and lease back. Like I said, in this private build and lease back approach, we use as a company to set up training materials at government, to install gadgets in government colleges of education. And from that center, they could broadcast training to the rest of the country. So people could sit in their homes, people could sit in a different location in a particular district, and then they can listen from the capital, the national capital, and the training is broadcast to them in various parts of the country. And so that was part of the things that we did to be, because we could not accommodate many people at one place. Thousands and thousands of teachers could not gather at one place. But then this private institution, Bosaki, installed these broadcast gadgets in a particular location, and the training was broadcast, and people in various parts of the country could get the training. In printing materials, and let me backtrack a bit and say that our PPP was pronounced during the COVID lockdown, where we had to do the National Reading Radio program. That was where it was very phenomenal. Why? Because number one, we didn't have enough coverage in the country. And so when you broadcast from the regional or from the national, there are many people, there are many regions that did not hear the lessons. And so communities had to approach, mosques had to be converted to learning centers, churches had to be converted to learning centers, members of parliament had to sponsor radio programs, opinion leaders, celebrities had to sponsor activities across the country so that local radio FM station frequencies could tap into the national broadcaster, and then people in the localities would have opportunity to listen to the lessons. Also, other NGOs, other civil society organizations came in and adopted the materials, printed them, and sent them to specific districts, hard to reach areas. So we had all these varied people, coming in and using mixed approaches to be able to get reading materials and to get lessons broadcast, to get, jingles sent throughout the country for people to be aware of lessons times, and parents actually assisting their kids to listen to the radios, sit by the radios, and we provided radio stations. So private companies also helped to provide radio sets, and they were distributed throughout the country, throughout the districts where we work. So that's the kind of approach that we use in this. And I think the last question, if I remember, you said, did it work? And any reflections? Yes, it did work. It did work very well. As a matter of fact, this is an activity, we just closed that out last month, and it's worth over $96.6 million over almost 8 point something years. And we even exceeded the target, because the target was, we're going to get 10%. That was almost like, 9 million. But as I spoke to you now, we calculated that in the regions of $16 million, public-private partnership, or if you like, cost share, that we're able to raise from the public. And this is made up of sometimes not just cash, but in-kind support that we had to value, we had to, put the cash, or if you like, the monetary value attached to it to be able to arrive at this conclusion that we had. And so if you ask me, yes, it worked very well. And my reflection is this, that look, I think Gustavo said something like that, or Harry said something like that. We needed to be able to expand interventions. I would say to expand interventions, because you see, even our learning program was not in all schools throughout the country because of this. But because of the PPP, it was extended beyond the original project coverage, way beyond. As a matter of fact, during COVID, during the National Radio Reading Program, everybody listened to it. I mean, students at that level throughout the country, including even private schools, because we're mainly in public schools. And so PPP is very necessary to expand our interventions. And I also want to say that PPP, doesn't just happen. It has to be well calculated. It has to be well planned. You can't leave it to chance. And so it has to be well planned. Now, we need government agencies need to be trained. They need to be made aware. Communities, local communities need to be trained. In fact, and that was what we did most of the times. We trained head teachers. We trained district directors of education to be able to identify PPP facilities, to identify companies in their localities, in their catchment areas, in their districts, in their regions, to approach them, how to negotiate for, public or private partnership is very key. And so we need to train people, where government provides wholesome, holy facilities. People are not aware, are not conscious of getting out of their comfort zone to look for support, to mobilize resources. But that was what we did, and it's really worked. We created the consciousness in people. I mean, and even traditional leaders, here in Africa, traditional rulers are very key in community development. We got involved. We got all the chiefs and the queen mothers involved, and they raised a lot of resources in the mining areas. Chiefs, got companies to raise money, to set up radios, and to be able to broadcast the lessons throughout the country. Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, everybody. I think I will end it here.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, for just a rich description of your public-private partnership. It seems like it was a very successful in expanding out coverage. Since we have only a few minutes remaining, I want to spend this time just addressing some of the questions. And a couple of questions have been raised from our audience. And this is directed to both Harry and Gustavo. And I'm just going to straight away go to those questions. And maybe we could start with Harry, and then Gustavo can then follow on to it. So the first question coming from Paul Napari is, when recommending low-cost private schools, are there concerns related to the quality of these schools that are not controlled by the government? If so, are there steps you can take to mitigate quality issues? That's the first question. And the second question that comes from Chris Van Kuren, there seems to be distrust of having the private sector come into the education system. It feels like we need to address this distrust before we can even think about this model. How do we address this? So maybe we could start with Harry to respond to those two questions, and then Gustavo can respond as well.
Thanks, Suzanne. Good questions. On the first one on low-cost schools, the concerns about quality, I think the approach there would be similar to what they did in the Punjab. So test the students, fund those schools that show promise, and keep testing them, and give them more coverage if they're doing well. So I think the funding should come with accountability. It's not simply expanding funds without monitoring. On the distrust of the private sector, I think here is where I was talking about the information campaign. I think the distrust comes when people aren't sure why we're partnering. And I think it goes to Gustavo's point that PPPs are a possible solution to a problem if they fit. It's not the solution itself. We're not expanding partnerships for the sake of expanding partnerships, but rather addressing issues. So having a good information campaign, going to the media and the public to make sure that they understand why these approaches are being done, to show them the results, to show them who's being targeted, and then to follow up with rigorous impact evaluations. There may still be distrust and people may not want this, but at least let's make the decision based on full information and the cost effectiveness of the programs. And in other words, let's not argue in ideological terms, but rather what works for improving learning outcomes.
Thanks, Harry. Gustavo, would you like to?
Yes, addressing this last point, I think it's important that I know many countries where the rhetoric of education can be very loaded about the privatization of education and so on. Well, in that campaign that Harry is talking about, one of the emphasis I would make is the use of non-governmental organizations rather than the private schools to avoid this polarization of the debate. But keeping in mind that you are informing the public about what is the problem and what you are doing, what is the contribution of non-governmental actors to improve the quality of education and the expansion of that quality. So information is crucial. In response also to Christine's question, that in that vein is one way of also working from within is to empower parents. And parents' participation in school decisions is going to be fundamental to legitimize whatever that partnership is doing. If parents are able to defend the school that has a powerful political and informational value that you need to exploit. And in terms of the quality of other schools, in the first question, I would say, again, what Harry mentioned earlier, you need to do a very good monitoring and evaluation of the results and be able to publish them. That is what people are afraid of, that you are giving money without knowing where it goes or what is the event, what is the result of it. And functioning with a good evaluation, it can be done by third parties, but you have to do it in order to inform parents and the public what went on with that money and what happened at the end.
Great, thanks, Gustavo. I want to turn to the next question to make sure we have time to address it. So this comes from Edward, and he's asking a question to you, Gustavo, regarding your presentation in particular. Regarding exercise 1, can you give examples of school subsidies funded by governments that increase access to schools? I'm wondering which types of in-kind subsidies can have a significant impact in low resource environments.
Yes. The biggest examples I have seen, even in large scale, are the cases of Haiti and Belize, where most students attend a non-government school. So the government is paying for teachers, and the private partner is paying for the infrastructure, for the operations, and so on. And obviously, they get the money from their sponsor. So that's the most prominent case. And I mentioned it in the report. There are other cases, for example, where the subsidy in terms of in-kind subsidies, we have to be very careful about calling it a partnership. Because if I give a subsidy of something, a one-time deal, it may just disappear. It's not a partnership. So we have to be very careful. The language of the contract is important. So what we have seen more examples is of the opposite, that the in-kind contribution comes from the investment in buildings and infrastructure of the private partner, and the public sector pays for the operations. that's where we see the partnership going.
Great. I think as we're coming up to the hour of 10:30 of ending it, and I think there's a couple of comments coming from Kazi about giving examples in Asia, and I know that Harry already shared about in Pakistan. There's quite a few examples on PPP, as well as the need to change the mindset about the private sector. And actually, that's something that USAID of the government changing the mindset. I don't know if it's necessarily in government, but it's all the education specialists out there to being more informed about what this public-private partnership and what it means to what the private sector can bring, instead of thinking as a threat or competition, so to speak, but that really, it's more of a resource to come to bear, and government is really overseeing. But just to do a shout out, we have something called the Education Finance Network that really works on this issue on blended finance in education. So recommend highly, and also a strong recommendation to look at the EduFinance report. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Andrew, to provide the closing remarks. Over.
Just want to huge thank you to everyone for your questions and answers. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but we will provide answers to unanswered questions in a follow-up email to participants. I'd like to thank all the presenters and panelists for a rich discussion today. I know for me, one of the things was coming back is that PPPs are a means to education goals. But as Paul mentioned, to be successful, we can't leave it to chance. We have to think about what are those conditions, accountability, capacity, monitoring, and evaluation. That more you can find in the guide to public-private partnerships. So encourage everyone to check out the EduLinks page, download a copy of the guide along with the 2 briefs that come with it around commonly used models of public-private partnerships and contextual factors to consider for choosing your PPP. So without further ado, thank you all for joining and have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much to everyone.